Hello everyone. Thank you for coming along tonight. My name's Nicola and I am Zali's electorate business manager. What that means is I manage the business down at the EO, as we call it, but that is the electorate office. Thank you for being very generous and accepting our change of date very, very last minute. We really appreciate you all coming along. I feel like now my next line doesn't quite make sense, but speaking of dates, it's Zali's birthday today. So a very big happy birthday to our incredible MP. I know I'm biased, but from all of us in the office. And thank you for sharing it with us all tonight. Even though it's Zali's birthday tonight is all about you and giving you the opportunity to ask those questions you have always wanted to ask. We are not going to spend much time talking up here. Most of the time we'll be handing the mic around to you guys and giving you the opportunity to talk. But before we go any further, I wanted to hand it over to Zali just to do acknowledgement of country and a small intro.
Thank you. Thank you, Nicola. Welcome and thank you so much everybody for being here. I know it's a Wednesday night and change of date was unexpected, but unfortunately we needed to do it. But when the opportunity to still have the event tonight came up, I thought it was so incredibly important. I would like to start by paying my respects to the Camaragal people here, their elders past and present, and that incredible custodianship of this beautiful land and country. Am I speaking loud enough just to make double sure? Fantastic. We are just absolutely blessed with incredible and rich heritage here in the lower North Shore of that custodianship from First Nations Australians. And it's always such a privilege when I'm doing citizenship ceremonies is actually when I talk to new Australians to remind them to be aware of that incredible heritage we have locally, especially around some of our coastal walks and our forests where we have incredible carvings and opportunities. So it really is a special area. Really important for me to be up here because of course you know the seat of North Sydney was abolished by the AEC. Many of you fought hard against it and the independent MP Carly Tink did an incredible job this term in representing the community. But unfortunately the seat of North Sydney was divided up into three and a significant portion, about 36,000 people, was brought into Warringah, and it includes Camaray, Crow's Nest, North City CBD, all the way to Wollstonecraft and Waverton, Kirribilli, Milsons Point, Neutral Bay. And so it really has expanded the seat of Warringah. It's now about 50-50 between, if I think of the infamous Spit Bridge as our middle mark of the electorate. It causes great headaches to all of us, but 50% of the electorate is now on the north side and 50% on the south side, so lower North Shore to Mossman and North Sydney, and then the other half being the beaches and the forest area. So it's a very diverse and very broad electorate, so incredibly important for me to hear from everybody in all areas, and that's why during this campaign we've had already a town hall at Crow's Nest. We've had a town hall at Mossman. We've had a pub event down at Brookvale, and now, of course, politics in the pub here tonight. So thank you. Now, I know there's been already a lot of questions lodged at the time of registration, so I feel we can go straight to questions. Because the team knows that if not, I probably will ramble on I will talk for too long. There's always a lot of things to say, but I want to hear from you. So we'll go to questions.
Thanks, Zali. I'm actually going to warm her up first before I get to the tough questions. I'm sure you've all heard would you rather. Would you rather bush or beach?
Oh, that's a hard one. Both. No, both, because ironically our electorate of Warringah is, we have incredible bush, like Australia has incredible bushland, and I love Manly Dam and running around Manly Dam, but I also love our coastal runs and walks, and in fact I've signed up for the Bondi to Manly Ultra in October, since 40 kilometres of it will be within Warringah electorate. As soon as you get off the Harbour Bridge, you're essentially in Warringah running all the way back to Manly. So I think that's a great way of showcasing our incredible coastal coves and beaches and walkways.
See, there's no short answer with Zali. Ultra marathons or slalom?
Well, slaloms were a thing of the past. Obviously, many years ago, that was my life with winter sports and the incredible privilege of representing Australia at the Winter Olympics. You learned a lot from sport, especially a winter sport in Australia where it's not the mainstream and you have to really be against the seasons, against the media interest. Back in those days, you actually had less than 2% of media coverage was spent on women's sport. So they really didn't do anything to help women in sport. It's up to about 15% now. So we've still got a way to go for everyone wanting to support women in sport, but it has progressed a little bit. But ultras now give me that active mindfulness. It's that time to be out in nature, to really appreciate what I fight for when I'm fighting for the environment and preserving it for future generations. But it's also, when we talk a lot about mental health and in our stressful, busy lives, it's really important to find what works for you in finding that way to de-stress, to find a bit of downtime. I must say, I don't answer my phone while I'm out on the trails, so that is why I really do enjoy a few hours out there when I can.
No short answer. Okay, biggest issue facing Warringah residents?
Well, look, there are many issues. Of course, really topical has been cost of living increases through a number of factors. We've seen the increase in interest rates and that flows through to a number of areas when it comes to cost of living. Of course, that flows through when it comes to energy prices and cost of so many things. Insurance has been one of the most inflationary elements to small business, to households, to local governments as well. And that's unfortunately on a trajectory that's only increasing unless we really address the underlying risk. And there is a whole structural question we need to look at in how do we balance the way our economy and investments relies on insurance taking care of the risk if the risk is becoming simply uneconomic. And we really are going to have to tackle this question as risk accelerates with climate change and warming. Major issues though, if we get to the really local, is around housing. We have some of the lowest housing availability rates in the country. Rental is incredibly difficult. And whilst many of us have benefited from very big increases to property values, especially over the last 5 to 6 years, it does have a consequence for younger generations. And so younger generations finding it harder and harder to save to get into the property market, but also to afford increasing rents and things like that. That being said, another issue is transport. Nothing is ever, there's no such thing as one policy issue that exists in a silo or in a vacuum of other things influencing it. And of course, transport has different challenges across different areas of the electorate. So whilst North Sydney is blessed with a great metro, great transport, they have a challenge of not enough parking, and that becomes a really difficult issue for local residents. But the other end of the electorate is really struggling with transport issues. We know buses have been irregular and unreliable, not enough bus drivers. We know we have an infrastructure problem. Spit Bridge was built in the 1970s, so it's a very old piece of infrastructure. And we have had both sides shelve the Beaches Link Tunnel. That was not popular everywhere in the electorate. So again, there's never a simple solution to the problems that we face.
Thank you. And I actually added this on because we've had so many calls and emails into the office about this particular topic. Do you vote with the Greens 71% of the time?
Okay, so everyone would know that there is no truth in political advertising legislation in Australia. So politicians can lie to you in their advertising. So you always have to be fairly sceptical about information that you're receiving and really test the source of it. That has been a very misleading presentation of what happens in Parliament and my voting record. What happens in Parliament, we have votes on second readings of bills and third readings and consideration in detail. So if you move an amendment, and I insist that I think this is a good amendment on behalf of the community, as long as 2 voices call for it, you can call for a division. What then happens, and you might have seen it on TV, the bells go and after 4 minutes the doors are locked and you have to go into the chamber to vote. Now, I don't control who votes for my amendments or my divisions. Now, of course, at times the Greens have voted in support of amendments that I have moved because they are environmental amendments or they make sense. And what has been misleadingly labelled is that somehow I am voting with the Greens simply because they are voting in support of motions that I have moved. In fact, when a division has been called by the Liberal Party or the Coalition, they generally call divisions together, I've voted in support of those 52% of the time. I'm 51 or 52, I think it's 51, sorry. When Labor or the government has called a division, I've voted in support about 52% of the time. And when the Greens have called a division on one of their amendments or issues, I've voted in support 55% of the time. So it's really fairly balanced. I guess the part that I would say is I genuinely look at each vote. Is it a motion? Is it a legislation? Is it grandstanding? Is it a genuine vote? Or is it politicking, right? Is it grandstanding or trying to be divisive by introducing a tricky title or a really inappropriate kind of comment on the legislation? And sometimes I will abstain where I feel the legislation or the motion is really divisive and seeking to inflame an issue, and I've abstained when it's been something from the Greens and from the Coalition in relation to the war in Gaza and Israel. So I have abstained from some of those votes because both sides, I feel, have been trying to politicise the distress in the community around hostages not yet being released, anti-Semitism, and the humanitarian tragedy that's unfolding for the Palestinian people.
That's actually quite a good segue into the first question. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask one question from those that have been submitted, and then I'm going to throw it over to you guys. So start thinking about what question you would like to ask, and then what we'll do is just put up your hand. I will try and get to as many of you as possible. If for some reason we run out of time, we do have a hard finish at 7:30, you don't get to ask your questions, Zali will be hanging around for a little bit afterwards, so feel free to come up and approach her, ask your question directly. So one question, then over to you guys. Warringah is a proud, diverse community. With so much global tension, how do we make sure that doesn't spill over into division here at home?
Yeah, look, that's been a really challenging time this term, because obviously there are frequently incredibly distressing conflicts overseas. And it is really important that I think we appreciate what we can and can't do from here in terms of controlling the outcomes of those conflicts, but also making sure we don't import that conflict into Australia, because I think that undermines us. Australia is only as strong as how united we are and how supportive we are, and we have to be respectful of other people's views and opinions, but once we're divided, I think we are weaker. In that sense, obviously it has been incredibly distressing for many members of our community. Obviously the hostages still being held in Gaza is incredibly distressing for the Jewish community in Australia, and that is something that is outstanding and that needs to be fixed. It's seen a rise of anti-Semitism, which again is incredibly confronting and challenging for many members of our community. At the same time, we've also seen very distressing images around the human rights and the humanitarian tragedy unfolding in Gaza. The two are not incompatible, right? And I think that's a really important part to remember for us as a community. We are a multicultural, diverse community, and we have to be mindful of that. And so I've supported calls when it comes to making sure international and human rights and aid is getting into people impacted in a war zone, and ensuring we have a humanitarian approach to people fleeing a war zone, and that we not pick and choose when we roll out support for people fleeing a war zone. So that's, to me, incredibly important. During this term, we have, though, had the referendum, for example, on the voice, and I think that really uncovered quite a racist underbelly in Australia. And in fact, late last year, the anti-racism framework was released. Many of you probably missed it. Not many people paid attention to it in Parliament, and the government has not given it the funding it deserves. I did ask the Prime Minister about it in question time, and I'm following up on that to make sure it's resourced. It has 63 really important recommendations that will help bring our communities together and make sure we have a plan and a strategy to address that. As a multicultural nation, it's incredibly important that we have that respectful approach to all of our cultures and all of our diversity. And I know, in fact, in the North Sydney area, with Kylie, there was a really strong push around a Human Rights Act, and I know I've talked with her a lot about that approach, and it's going to be really important, I hope, to be in a position to continue that work, to make sure we have that respectful approach. I think you would have seen in the election, for me, one of my core pledges is I feel at its core we should be able to all be safe at home, at work and online. And that is a really core commitment for me. That means domestic violence, it means racism, it means respectful communities, and at work, right? Respect at work, anti-discrimination legislation. It also means a duty of care online. It means dealing with gambling advertising. So all these things undermine our social cohesion, and we have to be really mindful to keep pushing to make sure we address them. So.
Okay, crowd. Who would like to go first?
That was rather refreshing, and as they say, never let the truth get in the way of a good story. So, thank you for explaining that. So, I don't think a lot of people realise how notions are voted on and feel that it's heard. So, I think now's time is more prevalent for independence than now than ever. Oh, can't hear me. How's that? So, I say we need more independence because never let the truth get in the way of a good story, and you keep them honest. So, please keep up the good work. My question to you is. Your environmental push, it's fantastic. There's a massive opportunity out there now to invest in alternative energy, so let's see some things like that. One of the things myself and a few of my comrades are passionate about is biodiesel. I'm fortunate enough to sail around Sydney Harbour during summer, watch the fast ferries zoom past and Manly ferries and that. And I've been doing a lot of research and I've gained a fair bit of knowledge on biodiesel, biofuels, and there's an opportunity where you could turn Sydney ferries into a greener fleet tomorrow. And there's an absolute drive out there and we're in a position where we can do it. But not only that, it increases fuel security for Australia with biodiesel. It reduces carcinogen emissions as well. Europeans have tested it. I think Manly Fast Ferry or RMA were involved in a test recently as well. It was a screaming success. What sort of push and drive is there from a parliamentary standpoint, both at federal and state, to make this happen? Because I've got a really document in my hand and we're going to make it happen tomorrow.
Okay, thank you. So what was your name?
My name's Adam.
Adam, thank you for that. Look, it's fascinating the developments that are happening around alternate fuel sources, and obviously there is a strong push to electrify a lot of things because that we have solar and wind capacity plentiful. But transport is a really tricky area, and that's where biofuels do come into it. Some areas will be able to be electrified, like I know there are sometimes ferries can be turned electric, but in other situations it is a question of turning to biofuels. So I'm really keen to see the paper you've got in your hand and look at that. I've got Kat here, who's my policy advisor, Catherine, sorry, Kat, but policy advisor, and we look at that and we meet a lot with a lot of stakeholders and groups we look at the integrated system plan when it comes to how our energy grid and where the shortcomings are. I talk quite a bit with the Climate Council, the Climate Authority, led by Matt Keane, around where are our opportunities and how are we going to address all those problems. Especially transport is vexing because if you look at our emissions, transport is 20% of our national emissions and growing because unfortunately as our population grows, so do the number of cars on the road because we Australians do love their cars. And we don't have a great public transport set up and train is really lacking, no fast trains. And so we have to look at that question of biofuels, especially for trucking and transport as well. When you look at the East Coast, so much of our transport goes up and down the coast, and it is difficult to completely electrify that. And so I do believe biofuels will play a role. Ironically, before COVID, I had a really interesting round table meeting with Qantas and a few other airline representatives around where airlines were looking at biofuels as a way of reducing emissions in the airline space, travel. it all got put on hold by COVID, as you can imagine. But I'm very keen to continue that discussion.
Fact that like regional farmers and things like that as well, it really plugs into their carbon plans, and it really puts back into regional communities as well, and it gives them another source of income, because we all know our country at any time can be. We all know our country at any time can be, flood, fire, famine, and that's just in 3 areas of it. So it really supports regional Australia as well.
And keeping in mind, from a fuel security point of view, we have a very short amount of time. I think it's about 20 days, maybe that, of fuel security in Australia. And that's assuming that everything makes it to Australia of the reserves that are purchased overseas, and that it's not, as you say, claimed by military for emergency kind of response. So it's really important that we look at how do we create less sovereign risk around our fuel security, and actually really look to what our domestic strength. And that strength is things like biofuels for the heavy transport sectors that are difficult to electrify, but it is going electric when it comes to our everyday transport, passenger cars. And the good news is the regulations and legislations that were passed during this term of Parliament with the fuel standards have seen a huge uplift. Even though they're not even fully in effect yet, what they have resulted in is already manufacturers are bringing in more cars, more electric models, and there's more to come. And we've actually seen about 173% increase in the last 2 years of electric vehicle uptake in our area. So that's really positive, because if we talk about cost of living and the pressure at the Bowser, the one way you can really reduce that impact on your weekly budget is if you have solar at home, and again, it's a package environment where the government needs to put in place incentives and assistance to get more households to electrify. If you can charge at home during the peak hours of the day, on the weekend, for example, you are not incurring those costs, the high excise costs when it comes to fuel. I appreciate electric vehicles are still quite expensive, and that is a barrier to entry for many. But with more choice comes more opportunity for lower cost models, and that is already improving dramatically in the last 12 months, and it's predicted to keep increasing and getting better. Many people are still choosing hybrids instead of fully electric. And I've talked to a few dealers, it's a little bit price point. The difficulty of going fully electric is too expensive. The other concern is still range anxiety, which ironically really is it's a leftover concern that's really not as real. There is a huge amount of investment going on by NRMA and other organisations into getting regional charging points. Even the traditional petrol stations like Ampol have now combined most of their freeway stops, now have fast charging infrastructure rolled out at the very same places as you might have stopped before. So I've got a little electric vehicle, it's got a range of 450 kilometres, I can drive to Canberra, and we have pressed, and now Parliament House does have fast chargers in Parliament House as well. So it takes time, but change happens gradually. But I appreciate it's not easy for everyone, and people living in strata units, for example, that don't have access to, or renters that don't have access to rooftop solar, need solutions as well. But that's where councils and communities are installing fast chargers, car parks, and in the CBD, Ausgrid are looking at it through their polls. There's a lot of thinking going on to help communities access all these technologies that do ultimately lower your everyday cost of living.
Why can't politicians be held liable for their promises? Like, if you run a business and you make false statements, you're in jail.
Well, we have very developed consumer laws. And when I came into politics in 2019, I was pretty shocked. I'd been a barrister for 10 years. I'd practiced in consumer and commercial law, and I'd ran many a case around consumer law and the old Trade Practices Act, for example. We have consumer law to protect you when you are spending your money, that you are not scammed out of your money by a product or a service that does not do what it purports to say that it will do. You can't, misleading and deceptive advertising is caught. And there are serious fines and serious consequences for that. Politics, Nothing like it. You can lie in political advertising, there are no consequences. The only thing the legislation does is say you can't misdirect a person in how they vote, in how you fill out the ballot paper. So it's a pretty low bar. Sadly, look, Labor, when they were in opposition during the Morrison government, promised that they would do something about it. I pressed them. I've introduced 2 private members' bill. They committed to it. They did, in fact, in November, introduce 2 pieces of legislation. One is called the Electoral Donation Reform Bill, and one was the Electoral Communication Reform Bill. Funnily enough, in the process of doing a deal between the Coalition and Labor around donation reform, which essentially was an agreement to give major parties a massive advantage compared to independents, and I should say, and vexing I think, a 47% increase to how much the public pays per vote from the 2028 election onwards. Now, there isn't a single other sector, from job seeker to youth allowance to the pension to anything else, that has received a 47% increase of public funding. But that funding increase went to votes, and there's an administrative fee. Millions will be paid to politicians and political parties through the electoral process. But part of the deal was the Coalition requested and the government agreed to shelve the Electoral Communications Reform Bill. So that bill was left off the notice paper and not pressed. I've continued to push, I've moved motions, and I've now introduced a voluntary ethical political advertising code. Now, it is not the complete solution, but it's my commitment to at least apply that standard in my advertising. I have called upon others to pledge to do the same. I am talking to the advertising industry for them to require it of anyone advertising through them. But also, I will look to reintroduce that if I'm re-elected in the next parliament and keep pushing for that code to apply. I don't believe voters should... It's the same as saying that voters can be scammed of their vote with lies, and I just can't understand how that is acceptable. And I know many people come back and say, well, it's freedom of speech and, you know, you can't control what people say. I've got to be really clear. This is about a question of misleading and deceptive facts. It does not prevent someone expressing an opinion, but you have to clearly label it as an opinion. You can't present it as a fact. We have for many years had courts that determine questions of fact. That's how our whole justice system works. And we have no protection when it comes to deep fakes and AI-generated content in advertising in politics at the moment. So it's a really dangerous time for misinformation to take hold, and we desperately need those guardrails.
Yeah, the biggest problem seems to be they're selling fear. No one is actually saying, I'm going to do this. They're all saying they're all arseholes, they're not doing this and that. And, you know, someone should get up. It's all very well to sit down here and talk like this, but someone should be positive. I don't care what party it is or what.
Well, I think that's what the community independent movement's doing. Look, our pledge since 2019 has been, we started with the 3 Ps, we're on the 4 Ps now. It's to be polite, positive, prepared and purposeful. And that means I don't have negative ads, I don't do negative advertising. My team, the volunteers, when they sign up to a code of conduct that requires them to abide by those values and principles. And the good news is there's about 35 electorates out of 150 that are now running community independent candidates. Now, not everyone will be successful, but we already saw in 2022, primary vote for major parties continues to drop. It's about a third now. A third of Australians will give their primary vote to a minor party or an independent. It is mostly expected to grow at this coming election. We will see on the 3rd of May where we land, but it is expected that slide of vote and trust in the major parties is expected to continue for this very reason. They want to keep lying because it's easy to sell fear instead of selling hope. That's not what I got into politics for. I'm here to try and make a difference, to try and fix some of these problems. I don't have the magic wand, I don't have magic solutions, but by working with the community, listening, being prepared to work with all sides of government around different solutions and actually, consider every proposal on its merits, consult broadly on the proposals and not oppose it just because it's the other side that's proposed it, I think we have to start looking to the future. How do we build an Australia that actually addresses some of our really deep issues around very core areas? We absolutely have to do it. If not, it's a complete failure. But the problem is people disengage with politics. The problem is politics is in your life. We have a great system in Australia. Voting is compulsory, and we have preferential voting. So it is an insurance policy against seeing what happened in America, and that really polarised politics where a third of Americans didn't come out to vote, right? It is a small amount of people that are engaging with that process. It's really important that we have protections against that in Australia, but you have to engage, right? It is not a spectator sport. You can't rail at the TV and complain about the outcome and say you hate those politicians, they're all liars, but not hold them to account, not turn up, not ask them questions, or really make them work for your vote. I think the system has relied for so long on apathy, on just, she'll be right, give me your vote. 3 years later, I'll come back and I'll make you a few more promises and she'll be right, don't you worry. But these things keep getting worse, and we have systemic problems that are going to need political courage. We need to step up to the plate, and we actually need to come together with different viewpoints, different ideas to solve them. Sorry, long answer again. As a barrister, I attended many a mediation with my clients. Now, a client will generally, especially in litigation, be pretty convinced of the merits of their argument, right? You're very entrenched in your viewpoint. But if you want to come to a commercial resolution of your dispute without having to wait for a judge to determine it, you're going to have to come and really put some common sense on the table. Think about what's the range of outcomes you're prepared to accept. What is a commercially acceptable outcome to get good, but not polarise and divide everybody? I've seen that work in areas of law where people are entrenched and really, really determined and committed to their view and their view only. I think it's what we desperately need in politics to get some good policy to take us forward.
Thanks, Zali. My question relates to the occupied Palestinian territories, and I commend you on standing up against Peter Dutton's proposal to ban all refugees coming from Gaza. That's really good and reflects very well on this community. My question goes to the point you made about importing foreign conflicts into Australia. There are reports that about 1,000 Australians have flown to Israel to fight for the IDF. You mentioned the distressing scenes that are coming out of Gaza. Is it really safe for us to be rubbing shoulders with people who might be coming back and might be in your local Coles or might be picking up a kid from childcare next to yours? People coming back from a situation where they may well have participated in war crimes. Do you have any proposals in order to keep Australians safe from that kind of potential conflict or issues?
Okay. I think, one thing I think we need to be really clear, that Israel has a system of military service and an expectation of coming back and serving in the military. And so I respect that is a part of the Israeli government and the defence and how that's happened. And so, yes, Australians have travelled to fight in the IDF. That doesn't, I would be very reluctant to then suggest that they present a safety risk back at home and in Australia to our multicultural community. And that's, I guess, my very concern about attributing motive that would then undermine our social cohesion here. I don't disagree that we do have an issue in Australia when it comes to racism and respectful discourse. And for example, that day in Parliament with the proposal to have no humanitarian refugee visas for Palestinians fleeing a war zone was utterly unacceptable. And I've been working with Tony Burke and ironically Andrew Giles before that to ensure there is a pathway. But unfortunately it does get so politicised and it gets exacerbated in the media, and that becomes really divisive and dangerous, and then you have a polarisation and people feeling unsafe. So I appreciate the comment. I would be reluctant, I don't agree that that presents a risk back to the Australian community. In fact, I think we just have to be really mindful that as a multicultural community to respect what is the expectation or what happens from different nations. So, but I appreciate not everything. It's not going to be enough potentially, but we do have to be respectful. Ultimately, Australian safety must always come first. I do get regular briefings from our security agencies around concerns about what is happening domestically. There's been a huge increase in radicalisation in Australia. Especially young people, and that is of great concern, and that's why there's been a lot of, request from the services for people in my position as MPs to be very mindful not to inflame community views and to create division. So that's, where I would put it. Thanks.
My name is Barbara. I'm a friend of the ABC. And at last week's monthly meeting, we were urged to contact our candidates, and just seems the best opportunity, to employ you to ensure that there are no further cuts to money to the ABC. In fact, more money back would be very, very good. Because, as we know, the Morrison government has an awful lot, not just on the shore, but in the Pacific and everywhere else.
Thank you. Look, I think it is incredibly important that we have a strong, independent national broadcaster. I think it is really, it's the fourth estate, the pillar of democracy is to have a strong, independent media. If you can't access information, democracy is really in trouble. And so that is why I think the ABC and SBS play a really important role. In our regions, for example, or when we have disaster strikes, they are pivotal in keeping communities safe and making sure they have access to local information around disasters, evacuations and things like that. I was really pleased to see the government reinstate and introduce increased funding when it came to, in the Pacific region. So from a soft diplomacy point of view, it's incredibly important to have that ABC, the radio, that presence in the region, because it creates stability and affinity with Australia, which is really important from a national security point of view. So I do strongly support that funding is there. Of course, the ABC must remain accountable, must remain true to its mandate through the Act, which is to be fair and balanced in its reporting. That is incredibly important. I do have a bit of a gripe with the ABC at the moment because they keep talking about community independence as teals all the time, and we are not. Well, the commercial media has labelled us that way, but the reality is we are all independents on the ballot and we should be named as such. There's also, a constant sort of focus on funding, but independents seem to be the only people referred to by way of who might be supporting them or donating to them. There is never an introduction of Peter Dutton funded by Gina Rinehart or the Minerals Council, right? You never hear Labor backed by the CFMEU or Peter Dutton backed by Gina Rinehart, but somehow independents always are tied to that funding question. And I should say I am not receiving funding at this election from Climate 200, but they play an important pivotal role for community independents who don't have the means to fight the big party machine and help them fundraise. I am lucky to be in a position where the support from the community allows me to run my campaign without the need for that support. But I know it's really pivotal. And in these elections where we have the growth of third-party organisations participating in our elections now, right? We have You may have all seen there was a truck running around Neutral Bay from Australians for Prosperity. They misspelled my name, but good try. We have Advance Australia. We have a lot of organisations participating in our elections, and they have funding of their own, and it is generally funding that is from a vested interest. So Australians for Democracy, for example, for Prosperity, is led by Julian Simmons, who was an ex-Liberal MP that lost his seat at the last election in Brisbane, and funded with $750,000 from the coal lobby. So this is not an independent group running around with advertising. This is a very targeted and purposeful. We also saw news reports that the Hotel Association and the gambling lobby were all keen to put money into fighting community independence in their seats with advertising, because they don't want to see gambling advertising banned or changes that might, undo the influence they have with the major parties. I think we've all got to be mature and aware that there are a lot of influences at play in our elections, and so trying to maintain a fair playing field is important. And I'll get back to the importance of the ABC. We have a high concentration of media ownership in Australia, and it's incredibly important that we do have that. I should say, though, there was this week the incident around, influencers now playing a role in our elections, and the question of what role they play and how that's engaged with. I think that if there is any exchange of financial support, it must be declared, and so something should be marked as a paid collaboration. The difficulty is we don't actually automatically have direction from the AEC that's always up to date with the situation at hand. But there is that nexus of influence that is always there, right? We can't forget that, for example, Tony Abbott he's a board member of Fox. Fox runs News Limited. You have Channel 9 hosted a fundraiser for the Liberal Party a few elections ago. So we know Kerry Stokes owns pretty much all of West Media and influences the West and their access to information. So there is a very tight nexus often between political parties and the media, and so an independent national broadcaster is incredibly important.
Hi Zali, my name's Sam. I'm one of the pesky public servants that Peter doesn't like at the moment. That issue aside, I have spent the last 8 years of my career working for the public sector in this Northern Sydney local health district. Having grown up on the beaches and working in the healthcare sector, I guess the issue for me that I'm voting for this election is the Northern Beaches Hospital. I have, grown up in the area, and I think it would be fair to say that from the beginning, that hospital has been plagued with a range of issues that don't relate to the staff that are working on the ground, really relating to the structural problems that comes with good governance, poor patient safety, quality, and a range of other, governance issues that time and time again we see have not been addressed and that continue to have really horrible negative impacts for patients and their families. I guess my question for you is, how committed are you to seeing, obviously they've said that they're not going to do any further public-private partnerships, which I think is a great thing and a great commitment, but how committed are you to ensuring that the Northern Beaches Hospital is transitioned back to the health sector?
Yeah. Thank you for that. Look, it is a really vexing question. I was born in Manly Hospital, right? So the Beaches end of the electorate had the benefit of Manly Hospitals, Public Hospital and Mona Vale Hospital. The two were closed under the Berejiklian government, I believe it was, and sold off, and then the Northern Beaches Hospital was established. It's a private-public partnership, for anyone not aware. Essentially a private hospital with a public emergency department, but it's limited to certain levels of emergency. It is. It has been really difficult for the staff working there. I've met with many of the nurses when they've been in their pay disputes and negotiations with the hospital administration. I've toured it, the premises around the request for mental health services and beds for mental health beds for juniors for acute crisis. That has been a really big problem on the beach. Beaches. And there's been a lot of issues with the hospital and understaffing and a lot of pressure on staff who are doing an incredible job in working incredibly hard. And so we're always very mindful of reminding the community the staff is just doing an incredible job in serving the community. But there has been some really traumatic incidents, deaths, fatalities, that have led to an acceleration of the review. So with independent state MPs, so Michael Regan and Jackie Scrooby at the other end of the peninsula, Dr. Sophie Scobbs, the independent member for Mackellar, and myself, we called for an independent review of the hospital some time ago. And then, unfortunately, with the recent incidents coming to light around fatalities, there has been, I can't remember there's been, I can't remember the acronym, sorry, about when there's a critical incident report around those occurrences, and that has accelerated the report being released. I believe it's being released today or tomorrow. Tomorrow is the auditor's report. HealthScope have come out saying they will accept that and they are open to looking at the hospital returning to public hands, which I think is very much what needs to happen. But that being said, it's not a simple thing to do. There's a certain amount of funding that comes to New South Wales from federal government for delivery of health services. It has been divvied up around the number of public hospitals we have in the state already. You don't just magically have a whole nother pot of money to run an additional public hospital. And so I'm not an expert in the field. There will be complications around how that can be managed or if it can be done. So I'm expecting the auditor's report that's coming out tomorrow to indicate whether that is the recommendation and how that may proceed. My understanding is the staff and the community very much want to see it become a public hospital, and I absolutely support that call. I'm just also pragmatic as to how that can be managed from a budgeting point of view for the state. All these issues of privatisation of public services, there's always a balance that needs to be struck between a public service that is not so big that it's too costly and we have completely mismanaged budgets, but there are essential services that the community needs that should remain in public hands. I think health and emergency departments are at one. I would argue transport is another. Unfortunately, the buses to the Northern Beaches were privatised, and that has been really difficult. We've seen not enough buses, not enough maintenance, and not enough drivers. So there has been, again, discussions. These are not automatically federal issues, but I am very focused on them because they come to me as being frustrations, and often it's about pushing for more federal funding to be done in partnership with the states to improve the situation for the community. So that is very much a focus that I'll stay on. Yeah.
Hi, Zali. My name's Jason. I work as a speech pathologist in private practice in the local community, and I see a number of NDIS participants. I guess I was interested in your thoughts on the current state of the NDIS. Just to preface my question, I've worked as a speech for 15 years, so I've seen how people with disability in pre-NDIS and post-NDIS, and the NDIS is amazing, but there are a lot of issues with it. I guess I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on the state of the NDIS in general, and then more specifically, what are some specific areas of reform that you're going to be pushing for if you're elected?
Yeah, thank you. Really important. Unfortunately, NDIS it's a great system of helping those that within our community that really needed assistance, but it was on an unsustainable trajectory from a budget point of view. The growth trajectory of the cost of the NDIS on the federal budget was simply unsustainable. And so during the last term we had the review, the 10-year review of the operation, and it had been allowed to become a beast that was poorly regulated and poorly monitored. So there were great cases of excess where sometimes state governments and then sometimes providers, as soon as NDIS was mentioned, prices nearly double and everything gets thrown on to being an expense of the NDIS. So we need really rigorous process to ensure the money that is allocated is well spent and is going to those that genuinely need it, not through rorting or fraud. So the review that occurred, and Bill Shorten before he retired, did identify areas of fraud, areas where it had been abused, but areas where there were efficiencies that could be met. And that's why I held a forum during the review. We heard from a lot of providers and participants. We fed that feedback back to the Minister and the team, and then we had another webinar event again after the review and the recommendations. I believe there are already some streamlining and savings in place, and in fact, the last week I was in Parliament, we had a briefing from Treasury and the Treasurer with predicted growth around what, sectors on the federal budget, and NDIS was the only one that had been reduced and brought back within an acceptable range. So that was really good to see, because fiscally I was very worried that it was becoming something that was simply unaffordable and unsustainable. So changes were made, like streamlining, for example, having a fast approval process where people with disabilities maybe have a fast degenerating issue that requires prompt assessment, but also where people have a permanent disability that should not require a review every 6 months or additional expensive reports to be prepared to request yet the same plan. There are administrative areas that still can be improved, where cuts are made without good reason to plans, and then there's an expensive process of appealing to reinstate funding, and it's just wasted money in a process that doesn't seem to be very logical. Savings that I've proposed and am still pushing for are savings where, for example, multiple participants live in NDIA residents, that they should be able to pool their transport plans so that they can, for example, invest in disability transport rather than having very expensive kind of transport allocations. There's also a question that state government have been deferring onto the NDIS system a lot of costs that they should be meeting. So especially around disability transport, that is a state responsibility when it comes to public transport. New South Wales has terrible disability access on its transport. Victoria is much better. And so that's an area where, again, the Minister and the government have to put pressure on state government that they need to deliver that so it doesn't come out of the budget for NDIS. But then I've also met with a lot of providers, and they need to feel supported. Sometimes the administrative burden, the registration process is expensive, and what I'm hearing is a lot of providers prefer to be unregistered because the registration process is an onerous expense that really doesn't add to it's just unaffordable for them operating their business. So again, I think it has to be a dynamic system that can adapt to the problems as they're identified. It's a great system. I think Australians should be really proud that we have a strong health sort of prevention and safety network. We have a great Medicare. NDIS is a great program. It helps the most vulnerable in our community and their families to continue being able to work and provide. But we need to make sure it's got guardrails to stay affordable, because the last thing we want to see is a program that gets so huge and so expensive that we can no longer afford it as a nation.
Could you quickly take one more here and then jump over to that side?
Good evening, Zali. Thanks for spending time with us. My name's Chris Absalom. Could you please give us your stance on the proposed self-managed super fund taxes that Dr. Jim is proposing, assuming he gets back in? It'd be very nice to hear your stance on that.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thank you, Chris. Very much opposed. So the proposal to tax unrealised gains in super funds was very much opposed. It was mainly presented by Stephen Jones, actually, who's now retired, and we, put there's a lot of arguments of why that is just poor reform and really dangerous reform because of how that interacts with assets and consequences that will flow through the system. And I think it will have a lot of unintended consequences that the government hadn't really kind of taken into account. Government had the numbers in the House to push that legislation through. I voted against it. Proposed amendments that they voted against. Ironically, for all their talk, the coalition did not support the amendments. Actually voted with the government against those amendments to not support to change those to delete those provisions in the legislation. The crossbench in the Senate, we work quite closely, and often amendments and issues that we've raised in the House, we will then are then raised in the Senate as part of those negotiations there, and as a result, the legislation didn't pass. And so that hasn't come into play. So again, it's that focus on legislation to make sure it's good law, that it has considered unintended consequences and who it's trying to address. So for example, that legislation, it needs to be indexed to ensure it doesn't encroach and disproportionately impact more people over time. But the taxing of unrealised capital gains was just an absolute no-go. I'm sure he is. Oh, look, of course he is. He will, that was their legislation, they'll try and push it. I mean, this is where, everyone tries to make everyone fear the idea of a minority government. The beauty of a minority government is you've got to negotiate your bits of legislation and you can't just push it through. The reality is no party has got majority in the Senate. So if it's a coalition government, they always have to negotiate with One Nation and the crossbench to get anything through. And a Labor government has to negotiate with the crossbench, the Greens and or One Nation as well. So the beauty will be is if they have to negotiate in the House even more, and they often do. Like I have passed about 20 amendments and gotten significant changes. Some ministers are more open to negotiation and collaborative work than others. Which is, it's something, it's work in progress. But I'm sure he has that view, but that doesn't mean his view will prevail.
Thanks, Zali. This is a bit of a segue from the comments on the NDIS. My life's been spent in adolescent mental health and in intellectual disability mental health. And I'm somewhat very concerned, actually, about the issue of adolescent boys and toxic masculinity, the arising from manosphere, and just curious about how the federal government is responding to this. It's a vexed issue. Teachers are leaving en masse, and it's a great concern with respect to the way our adolescent boys are disappearing into their bedrooms on their iPhones and soaking up the Andrew Tateisms. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Look, I've watched Adolescent on Netflix and got a chill down my spine. For any other parent, my kids are young adults now, but are still pretty scary. It is really worrying, and we are getting those reports and warnings around radicalisation is on the rise, and in particular young men, 18 to 25 at a higher record than ever before. And I think that comes back to leadership and being mindful of having guardrails around, for example, social media. And I strongly support that we should have a duty of care on social media platforms so that they are on the hook financially for the care for the harm they cause. We see that around radicalisation, but we see that around eating disorders and mental health as well, because they control the algorithms, no one else can. Unfortunately, the government took an approach of thinking, well, they were trying to detract away from our push for gambling advertising to be banned, and so decided on an age restriction of under 16 on social media platforms. That's got a year to be worked out by the e-Safety Commissioner of how that will be possible, and pretty much every expert says it's actually not feasible, that young people will work their way around it. So that does come back to our question around respect, dealing with that issue of toxic masculinity, and I think it comes back to leadership. Just as for a long time we said of young women, you know, you can't be what you can't see in terms of aspiring to be in leadership position and politics and things like that, I think the same applies for young men. You know, you can't be what you can't see. So they need to see positive, caring role models in men of what is good masculinity. The idea that equality can only be achieved at the expense of one side of the community is wrong. We are all better the more equal we all are. I always give an analogy of a sporting field. Australians love their sport. If you think of your favourite team, if you only field half the team, how are you ever going to win the game? You will only win the game as a nation if we field our whole team. That means all sexes, everyone with all our, everyone should be respected and embraced and given that opportunity for participation. You know, I was horrified when Scott Morrison, on an International Women's Day event some time ago, made the comment of, equality for women is all good, but it can't be at the expense of men, right? This idea that for women to get equality, the men are going to lose something, they're going to give something up. I just really reject that proposition. I think we all benefit if we all have that opportunity and equality of opportunity and access. So, but it falls back on everyone. It's great to see so many men in the room. You all bear that responsibility of being positive role models. I have called out our leaders in Parliament who too often resort to behaviour that is unacceptable. I have criticised the Leader of the Opposition, Peter Dutton, for that, because too often he takes the stance of tough guy hitting down instead of bringing people up. And I think there's a real difference in strength in actually calling for unity and strength together rather than accusing or blaming others, dividing and trying to push people down. So I think ultimately as a society it's going to fall on all of us to call it out. You know, we need male champions of change and those positive role models. That's why anyone who attended, I was really pleased. Carrick Ryan came and spoke at my launch last week, and he is a really good role model for young men. He, a strong moral compass, a strong sense of what is right and wrong, and how you can be that role model. So I think just as much as you can't be what you can't see for girls applies, it applies for young men as well.
Hi Zali, thank you. My name's Ardi and I'm recently moved to Cremorne and recently a father of a beautiful baby girl who I'm like half of tonight. I really feel privileged to be around here. It's a wonderful area. However, I do see there's a barrier to entry within a place like Warringah. I'm in the top 10% of earners in Australia. However, I don't think I could be able to own shelter in such a lovely place here. I guess my question to you is, do you believe that young people will ever be able to own shelter in a place like Warringah? And if so, what are you doing to support that goal?
Thank you. It's incredibly important because we have to combine concern around planning rules that are changing, that are encouraging more construction in our area, so higher density, and it is fairly vexing, some of the sort of planning proposals that state government has put forward, and we do then worry about losing the feel of our communities and having overdevelopment, especially if transport isn't improved in conjunction. We need to have that infrastructure done hand in hand. But for our next generation, for young people to be able to live in our area, we need some housing that's affordable. We do need to keep building, but we need to look at our system. We have two key areas that are a problem. We have supply and we have affordability. So supply, you would have seen in the last 2 days, Coalition and Labor have been putting lots of promises out there around assisting with, entry into the market with from tax deductibility on new purchases for first home buyers. I'm highly critical of that because that's only new builds. It's not it's not uniform to all first home buyers. And then Labor have also done their proposal around expanding the 5% deposit, assisting in other ways. And then they have made a commitment around increasing supply and building more homes. The problem is, though, no one's really looking at the short to medium term issue of how do we get more supply now. And we have so many barriers, right? We have a system that disincentivises people from downsizing or freeing up any current stock or better utilising. You know, you can't rent a room in a house, for example, without impacting your capital gains exemption and earnings, or if you're a pensioner, it will impact the pension. So I think there's a lot of levers we could be looking at now in the short to medium term to free up capacity of our current stock, right? Get better utilisation. There's data around like millions of empty bedrooms around Australia because people are staying in homes, because stamp duty is a disincentive to downsize because you've paid off your home, why would you purchase another one? There's a lot of complications with that because that's a state issue. We also have to talk about, and I raised this on Q&A on Monday night, we have to talk about our system that really incentivises home ownership as an investment strategy. It has been incredibly beneficial for a lot of Australians, a lot of people in our community. But it has created a system that is an absolute barrier to entry when it comes to affordability of home ownership. And it has a knock-on effect when it comes to rental prices, and everything else is impacted. I completely this is not a system you can change overnight, right? Because it's going to require some political will for everybody to come to the table on this. And it's a really easy area to do a scare campaign on, right? But I have asked the Parliamentary Budget Office to do some costings for me so that I can bring to the community some data around what would, for example, be the impact to the budget if we start scaling it back, some of those provisions. I hosted a housing forum last year in Bargala, and experts indicated we spend about $22 billion a year on investment concessions around housing. So 20 billion on capital gains exemptions on investment properties. And please, family home is completely separate to this discussion. This is on investment properties. $20 billion and about $2 billion on negative gearing. So it's clear that capital gains exemption around investment properties is a big part of the budget and impact. So I have asked for costings around what if it was scaled. So you maintain the same exemption for the family home. You can still have the 50% exemption for your first investment property. That would reduce to 25% for the second property, and it would no longer be there from the third and onwards. So what impact to the budget to start scaling that back so that you can still have investment in property as an investment strategy. I think, from 1 to 2 properties is a fair investment strategy. But it can't be left completely unregulated. We have to start putting some guardrails around this. So I'll be really keen when I get the data back from the Parliamentary Budget Office to understand what the impact that is, and then what is the political will for this discussion. It has been incredibly difficult. You're not hearing it from any of the major parties, but people like Ken Henry say, unless we start having this conversation, the intergenerational debt and difference is just going to continue to grow. We also have to have a tax reform conversation when it comes to our revenue raising, because younger generations are bearing a burden that they simply are not going to be, we're just not going to manage as an economy. Currently we have about 3.7 people working per person over 65 and retired. That's going to reduce to 2.7 in 2060. So with an ageing population, with an increased cost base when it comes to services like aged care and NDIS and all the other services, we will have a smaller base that will be working to actually create that tax revenue. We have to start taxing our resources. I mean, the petroleum resource rent tax has to be increased. Our gas companies are paying less tax and we will collect from beer excise, right? So when you have a beer, the government collects more revenue from that than the mega millions made from gas companies exporting it. And it's ultimately an Australian resource. So I've digressed from housing, but once you start talking revenue and tax reform, you have to really look at holistically at a lot of areas. And then we do have to have the conversation around that construction for the future. You know, what level of increased density are we prepared to accept to ensure we have nurses, teachers, ambulance drivers, police living and working within our community. I think we do need a 10% mandatory affordable housing within developments and development applications, so that a proportion of all major developments has to be set aside essentially for essential professions that we need to have within our community. A classic example, bus drivers, right? We've now got the state government to commit to more buses. We cannot get enough bus drivers to drive the buses, which is pretty frustrating. I mean, I've now been asked, would I press the immigration minister for a visa pathway to permanent residency around bus drivers so that we can attract bus drivers in so that we can get people to drive our buses. So, you know, every area is interrelated and we need to look at all this holistically to make sure it works. But and housing is vexed. It's taken 40 years to get to where we are. It's not going to be fixed with one policy, but we do need everybody at the table to start looking at the solutions. But I do appreciate our area is an incredible area to live in, right? We are the second most affluent area in the country, the second most affluent electoral division in the country. But that still means we still have a vast range of people living in the electorate, and there are many people doing it tough. The demand on food banks and organisations like One Meal is at a record high because people are really struggling with costs. So we have to always be mindful. And unfortunately, a lot of the policies around that entry into housing are often capped at thresholds that don't ultimately apply to Warringah. I do welcome that Claire O'Neill and the government announced the increasing of the cap of the Help to Buy to $1.5 million properties. So that means it will capture some of the median home prices and apartment prices in Warringah. So that will now be available at least from a first homeowner's point of view.
Okay, we're getting close to time, and there's 3 people who've been waiting very patiently. Okay. So maybe we can do them
quickly. I promise 30 seconds or less.
Zali, thank you very much for this evening. It's been great. My name's Annabella. Political will. On the question of superannuation, you indicated that the crossbench moved amendments, but even the coalition did not vote for them. Why? What do you think that was behind that? So what is the political will? What's the political agenda? With housing, I mean, that is such a vexed issue. Where is the political will? Do you think it will be there?
Well, I think the more we diversify Parliament, the more we will build political will, right? You need more people at the table. There's a lot of games played between the major parties in Parliament, sadly, I have to say. We saw that around housing and the HAF. We saw that around Help to Buy. We saw that around the instant asset write-off for small businesses, where it was not ultimately passed until the very last minute, which makes it impossible for businesses to rely on it. I think that is the benefit of a minority government. You develop political will because it means more viewpoints are at the table and negotiation has to happen. So, but it's also political will be informed by the communities. The more communities engage in your democracy and you require and demand better, that is how it will change.
Thank you, Zali. My name is Alan. I was also an Olympian. I might stand corrected here, but is it possible to go along to the polling booth on the day for your vote, to go along and have your name ticked off, and then screw up the paper and throw it in the bin, not go through the procedure of casting a vote?
Absolutely, you can do a donkey vote, but again, then you can't complain about the outcomes, right? Again, I'm really proud. Warringah's had one of the lowest non-compliance votes for the last 2 elections. I think because we've really been stressing to people, you've got to number every box to make your vote count. But democracy, you have to participate, right? The outcomes, the people in Parliament are there because they have been voted in by their communities. So if the communities are not happy with them, they are directly responsible. I describe an election is I have a job interview every 3 years with about 120,000 people, right? It is, you have to be convinced and you have to be available and listen to the community and engage with it. And too long, I don't think that's happened. I think communities have been taken for granted. There's been allegiance to political parties and how people have voted, and there hasn't been enough scrutiny on what is done with that vote. It's like a proxy vote, you know, it's a backbencher turns up in Parliament and just follows the line. When I first got into Parliament, one of the first things I saw was a wall of pages. And I asked, oh, is one of those for me? And I was told, no, they're just for the political parties. And those pages tell them when to vote and what to do and where to turn up. And I've been in the lift many times, heading down to the chamber. The bells are ringing, we're heading to a vote. And I'm asking an MP, and there's been Labor MPs and there's been Coalition MPs, to say, okay, well, you know, why are you voting for this? Aren't you concerned about these issues around this piece of legislation? Or this is a really good amendment, why aren't you supporting it? And they have no idea what they're heading down to vote on, right? They are completely, it may or may not have been discussed in the party room, they may or may not have had any contribution. We just never know. And I have been so many times down in that chamber with so many MPs that have no idea what they're voting on. And I think that is unacceptable.
Hi Zali. First of all, I have to say I think you've been a breath of fresh air to this electorate and very valuable. I'm hoping you get elected in the next election. My question is, I'm a renter in Neutral Bay and it doesn't affect me firsthand, but I understand that the local council is increasing rates dramatically due to fund the poor. And my question is, can anything be done federally to help fund the poor because it's in such a nationally iconic spot and all that sort of things?
Thank you. Yes, that is a very vexed question. Our local governments are under stress. So a New South Wales government report identified about 66 local governments are in stress fiscally, right, at risk of insolvency. There's a number of factors in that. There are often mismanagement and cost savings that need to happen around their operations and choice of events and things like that. There is also costs that are being deferred from state governments to local governments. So what's happening, and I was actually getting my team to double check the numbers for me because I couldn't remember them earlier, and I thought this might come up. In New South Wales in 2022 alone, there's $1.3 billion that was cost shifted from state government to local government, and that actually equates to $460 per resident. So if you start thinking about the 87% rate increase for North Sydney and the 44 or 47 proposed for Northern Beaches, a lot of it is right there. And that was in things like library funding and emergency services contributions. So what's happening is state government, to make their books balance, they're asking local governments to meet those costs, which then means you are, right? Through paying your rates and levies, the community is paying for it. And the problem we do have is with increased events and storms, the cost of those kind of recovery, cleanups and emergency services is escalating. And just as households are struggling under the cost of insurance premiums that are going up, so are small businesses and so are local governments. So we have to talk about that, and that's why federally, absolutely. I've proposed a climate resilience plan and a $10 billion climate resilience fund, to first and foremost go to local governments to help meet some of those costs, right? It's just unacceptable that residents are left. And I'm funding that, importantly, by a phase out of the diesel fuel excise that the mining companies get, right? Which is a full $10 billion as well. When it comes to the pool, for example, for North Sydney is a part of it, but it's not the only part of that rate increase for local government. Unfortunately, the pool is a classic example of what we're seeing a lot of at the moment is the pork barrelling that happens around elections, right? Promises get made around projects, not always where due diligence has happened on the project before you promise the money, and then the money comes and then the project gets bigger and there isn't the funding there to meet the full cost of the project. And that's what I understand has happened with the North Sydney pool. An original grant from a regional communities grant was enough for a small renovation, right? It was $10 million, and it has escalated way beyond that. And I do agree, it's not okay for such an iconic location to be left to be borne just by the residents of the North Sydney LGA. And I think there is the case for an additional grant from federal government, for example, to meet that remaining cost that's required. It's such an iconic location there in North Sydney, from a tourism, for New South Wales, for Australia, it has to be addressed. So I'm having discussions with the local council, with the Mayor, Zoe Baker, around what is needed, what component of the rates can be met that way, and what would be the ask of federal government. Of course, at the moment with an election, there's no one I can ask, but it is on my list of, I guess, jobs in terms of taking over the North Sydney area, that this issue has to be resolved and we have to assist the local community.
Okay, I think that's probably it. Everyone probably is here at home. I did warn you, her questions, or her answers to the questions are long and detailed. She does love her detail. Zali's going to be hanging around for a little bit afterwards, so if you did miss out on asking a question, big apologies. David's got his hand up. Oh, do you want to see happy Thank you everyone for joining. Really appreciate you being here.
Thank you.